So one of the things I'm going to do is introduce the panelists here, and you'll be quite overwhelmed with their great experiences. And just to get everybody warmed up, what I'd like you to do is, after I introduce you, just tell us about a teacher or a mentor that made a difference in your life, and someone that you look up to, and maybe a little bit about why. We have the Honorable Levar Stoney with us today, the mayor of Richmond. He's a product of Virginia Public Schools. He's the first in his family to receive a high school diploma. He was the student body president at James Madison, and he was instrumental in implementing the governor's order to re-enfranchise 18,000 of our fellow Virginians. So we're very happy to have you here today, Mr. Mayor. Do you mind sharing with us just a brief anecdote about someone who's made a difference in your life?
I would say the person that always stands out for me is my father, who was a former offender, never graduated from high school, but despite all that, he told my brother and I that we could do anything we put our minds to. And he made a lot of sacrifices to ensure that we actually lived in the right school district, and that's how I became the first in my family to graduate from high school, and I have the opportunity today.
That's outstanding. Next is Stephen Olikara. He is a public servant, a political entrepreneur. He is the founding president of something called the Millennial Action Project. He was a Udall and Truman Scholar, and he speaks frequently on leadership in the next generation. So Stephen, tell us a little bit about someone who's made a difference in your life.
I would say my brother, who's done a really good job of never taking me seriously and who has done a great job of keeping me grounded. I try and explain, he's an engineer in my hometown of Milwaukee, and I try and explain what I'm doing, and he's like, yeah, that's great, like whatever. So he's been a great influence in my life, and he has a never-ending sense of humor. So if my brother ever watches this, thank you for keeping me grounded.
That's fantastic. Laura Weidman Powers is a graduate of Harvard and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's the co-founder of something called Code 2040, which aims to close the achievement, skills, and wealth gap in America. Quite an ambitious goal there, and we want to support her in that. She was also a senior advisor to the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, who was Megan Smith in the Obama White House. We're really happy to have her in Charlottesville for a second time, I believe. She came here recruiting once before, so thanks for coming back. And can you tell us about someone who's made a difference in your life, Laura?
So I don't actually know this person's name, but when I got to college, I remember sitting in an auditorium with the 1,600 other freshmen, and the dean of students said, while you are here, you never need to take no for an answer. And I remember thinking that was a super bold thing to say to a bunch of 18-year-olds that you were like in loco parentis for the next 4 years. But I really took that to heart, and it shaped the way I think about when you ask for permission and when you hear a no, what you do with it, and what you can achieve when you have that mentality.
Thank you very much. So, folks, one of the things we're trying to understand in this panel is why some things in America are working so well and some things aren't. If we look at Silicon Valley, there's a very good blueprint there for how distributed thinking is working, how this is making ideas scale very quickly. But unfortunately, that's not happening in the government. And so we've got some great experts here to kind of lead us through that discussion. But that's what I'm hoping we can get to, is understanding that idea a little bit better. So let's start with this question, if it's okay, guys. The tech community talks a lot about user experience and being user-centric. Who is the user that we're maximizing the government for? How do we think about that? How do we make sure that it works for them? And Laura, let's start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I run a startup in Silicon Valley, but it's a bit non-traditional because what we're trying to do is leverage the tech sector to close the wealth gap and end structural racism in America. No big deal. So we think really differently about kind of who our user is in the midst of this really user-centric culture. And then on top of that, as already mentioned, I was in the Obama White House and thinking about how to port some of those learnings from the private sector into government, where your user is the American people. And so I think when we have this conversation, I think about sort of the macro trends in society, and it's one thing to design for any individual, or perhaps even the average individual, or the individual who's most likely to buy your product, which is usually the way user experience and user design is thought of. And it's another thing to be really conscious about what is often described as the edge case, or the person who's maybe not the typical user but has their own needs from your work. And so a lot of what we're doing at Code 2040 is taking that mentality of how do you think about user experience design and iteration and testing and failing forward, and bring that into the social sector and into this idea that you can actually use some of those principles to best serve the American people and the American economy. And we believe that you're best doing that when you're closing the gaps that we see and ensuring that everyone has access to the same, not just opportunity, but equity. And that we're actually, over the course of the next 25 years, closing those equity and wealth gaps as opposed to perpetuating them by doing more of the same.
And Laura, can I ask just a quick follow-up there?
Sure.
So one of the things we know about user testing is you're going to make a lot of mistakes,
Yeah.
right? Is there a mistake that pops to mind that you're comfortable sharing along this process that you learned from, that you said, oh no, if I had to do that again, I probably wouldn't have done that? But that's one of the big differences between the private sector and the public sector right now, is the tolerance for mistakes.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point because you know, there's sort of the old saying, like, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Like, if you do the thing that everyone's doing, even if it doesn't work out, like, you don't get in trouble. And if you do something new and it doesn't work out, like, you almost always get in trouble. And so part of the culture that we need to build around doing this sort of social and economic equity work is that tolerance for failure. We know what we're already doing doesn't work. We know that. And so we can't punish people for trying something new that also doesn't work, or we're never going to be able to iterate. And there's countless examples. You know, as we were starting Code 2040, we're about 5 years old, and our flagship program is the Fellows Program. We bring top performing students in computer science from around the country to the Bay Area for a summer immersion. They intern with tech companies, and we do a career accelerator in the evenings and weekends. And there are so many times when we messed up in whether it was placing students in our partner companies in matches that didn't work out, or creating curriculum that didn't have the impacts we thought it would, or not having enough supports for students who are making a big transition for a short summer. But all of those things enabled us to iterate and solve those challenges and actually learn what we need to do to scale, and also what we need to share with the industry so the industry can upskill. Because we know that the tech industry doesn't have all the skills it needs around diversity and inclusion. But only through those experiments and messing up can we actually learn what we need to teach.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, your body language suggests maybe you have something to say on this subject as well.
Those ready.
Well, you know, I mean, when you're the mayor, of a mid-sized city, you have 220,000 users, and they can be very prickly sometimes. What I've done in my first 100 days is not to do my best not to lie about what we can deliver. And the users are, the demographic, it's a varied demographic. You have individuals, we have 26% in our city live under the poverty line. Then we have people who come from great wealth in the city of Richmond. What I've come to find out, everybody wants the same thing in terms of what government can deliver. They want you to fill the potholes. They want you to pick up the leaves. They want you to cut the grass, things of that nature. But very, very long time, though, our city has kind of ignored delivering those services at a high quality. And I've chosen to be a truth teller in the first 100 days. And just inform folks that right now we don't pick up your leaves on time. The leaves fall on the ground around October, November. We don't get to them until March. And so, yeah, I know. And so I think what I've decided to do is, like, number one, ask the community for a little bit of their help, but just tell the truth. What we've done for a long time is we've overcommitted and then underfund on those commitments. And so I'd say, well, how do we change this? We need a little help from you, but we also need a little help from our technology community, our entrepreneurial community as well to get some of this done. So what I'd like to do, what we've already begun doing is reforming how we deliver some of those services, but also asking our local entrepreneurial community to actually come in and give us some ideas on how to run government a little bit more agile. Allow it to be more agile. I think for far too long we've heard a number of times that when we ask the question, why do you do it this way? Oh, we've been doing it the same way for 25 years. Well, to me, that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to have potholes littering streets. It's unacceptable that sidewalks are broken. We have to find our way. We have to think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Mr. Mayor. And Stephen, you're working on a little bit different problem, which is the future of leadership in the next generation. And so, tell us a little bit about how millennials process the world a little different from maybe other generations. And if you're comfortable telling us about a mistake, we're always happy to hear about that.
Sure. Well, thank you, RD, and thank you, Paul and Carolyn, for having us here today. I think there's no place I'd rather be on Thomas Jefferson's birthday than right here in Charlottesville, Virginia. I also want to say...
it's a suck-up ample, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good one, though.
But I'm not running for mayor of this town or for any office in Virginia. But I also want to give a shout out to my good friend Doug here from James Madison's Montpelier, who has a lot of great programming. You all should go to Montpelier, and he was key in getting all of us together. So thank you, Doug. So millennials, let me just say, I run the Millennial Action Project. We activate these millennials who are entering public office at the congressional and state level. And the question is, how is this next generation going to govern differently? Today we're too divided, too gridlocked, polarized, dysfunctional, and that's having a huge impact not only on the problems that we're facing today, but if you think about all the long-term problems that our generation is going to inherit in the future, like climate change, for example, we're on an unsustainable track and we keep kicking these problems down the road. So how will millennials be different? Well, we're seeing already, and by the way, your former boss, Congressman Seth Moulton, has been a huge force for good in Congress, and he's active with our Congressional Future Caucus, is one, we've seen that millennials are just less jaded when they enter politics. They believe in actually making a difference. They think things are possible. Two, they're more open-minded about building collaborations, whereas on a debate like, say, immigration, you just think, oh, I can't get this other side on board. We're seeing that younger policymakers actually believe, let's actually try this out, let's try and build these coalitions. The third thing we're seeing on this topic about user interface is that, and this shouldn't be any surprise, young policymakers are early adopters of new technology. They're more willing to be tech forward. They will, for example, utilize technology to help crowdsource policy ideas from their citizens. They'll use social media more actively where the barriers to entry to participate are much lower. So they'll use technology, and then on tech policy issues like the sharing economy and entrepreneurship, we'll be much more forward-looking on those and taking a leadership role on those issues. The last thing, and potentially most interestingly, is that we're seeing younger policymakers are less beholden to traditional special and entrenched interests. I think the whole debate around the sharing economy is a great example of this, where we've seen the issue very much cut along generational lines, and you're seeing a lot of old industries getting disrupted. There are a lot of entrenched industries, entrenched interests, and money coming in from those industries, and you're seeing this new generation saying, we want to embrace innovation, we want to provide more effective services to our citizens, and if I'm not getting money from the taxi cab union, for example, that's okay, because we want to promote innovation. They're much more interested in getting donations, for example, from a lot of small donors, as opposed to the traditional PACs and super PACs and things like that. So I'm really optimistic because of that, because I do think we can create a more open and transparent government because of this new generation of leaders that's entering office.
That's great. At TomTom here, there's lots of different programs. We're at the Hometown Summit now, which is a convening of leaders in cities like Charlottesville. Part of the programming there is called, one thing is called the Virginia Policy Entrepreneurs Retreat, where they're providing a curriculum to people who want to bring this kind of thinking into government. So what would be one suggestion from each of you if you could add something into that curriculum you really want people at the local level to understand about how technology works or how we can make the government look more like that? Can we get some suggestions on like, oh, this would be a great thing to do, or I wish I had known this 24 months ago? Laura, look, do you have an answer at the ready?
Yeah, I think the thing I would encourage is to think about not just who is the user for the technology, but who's designing the technology. Because too often we see kind of the folks with the existing resume or pedigree who are creating these tools are not actually representative of the constituents that you want to serve or support. And that creates huge design challenges. So particularly when you're talking about the idea of integrating technology into government and bringing some of the principles of technology into policy, ensuring that the folks who are advising and building have a varied background that represents the folks that you are representing and serving is extremely important.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think in this moment right now, it's very important, I think, to teach simply listening to ideas that contrast with your own views, especially at the local level. Fortunately, the issues tend to be a little bit less partisan and have more practical implications. But I'm very concerned that the many polarizing forces in our society today, which include the way we consume media, the way that social media creates echo chambers for ourselves, the ways that we're geographically sorting into areas where we're living next to neighbors who agree with us, among other issues, is causing us to lose the art of listening. And I think when the founders came together in designing this country and this form of government, they basically wrote in the art of listening into the Constitution. So that would be my number one recommendation is being able to hear contrasting views, allow data to really lead your thinking on various policies, and be able to have a constructive conversation. Because if we don't bring civil discourse back to our country, we're going to be in a lot of problems.
Mr. Mayor?
I'm going to say my answer is along the same line as Stephen's. That is, what I've experienced thus far in government is the lack of collaboration. This whole silo mentality, and it ends up being almost a zero-sum game, because if I don't win, then no one wins. It's kind of sort of where government is right now. And I think what I've chosen is not to run government by dictatorship or singing decrees down from some ivory tower. Instead, let's get the people around a table that matter to solve the problem. In local government particularly, it's not Democrats versus Republicans in the cities like Charlottesville or cities like Richmond. It's normally people of the same political ilk, same political ideology. And so the difference, though, the demarcation between the leaders in the city normally are around solution-oriented or problem-oriented. It's easy to stand on the sidelines and say, there are problems all over the place. But it's a lot harder to get yourselves around the table and start focusing on the solution. And that's where I've chosen to do that instead of actually say, you know what, I'm the only one who knows the answer and do it the way I've asked to do it. I instead want to get everyone in the organization, 4,000 plus people who work for City Hall, bought in on the solution, but also the people who are going to be using what we're delivering bought in on the solution as well.
That's great, and it reminds me of a saying, don't ask the user what they do, measure what they do with the tool you give them, and that's a great principle. Laura, I want to talk about Code 2040. I am passionate about this organization, and I want you to tell us how we're going to accomplish the mission here.
Sure. So Code 2040 is named after the year 2040, which is the start of the decade when people of color will be the majority in the U.S. And we see that as our call to action to close the wealth gap in this country and create more economic power and, by extension, social and political power as well. And we see this as a systems challenge. So when I started Code 2040 in early 2012, The tech sector is notoriously not very diverse, and the narrative at the time was that the reason for that was that there just weren't talented people of color out there to hire. And Code 2040 is built on the premise that just because you can't find them doesn't mean they don't exist. And it's not necessarily a pipeline problem, but a pathway problem. And so what we did was started to build those pathways, connections between the opportunity in the industry and the talent around the country that frankly was, in many cases, ready. So the Fellows Program, which I described, is our flagship, but we've actually not just grown the Fellows Program over the years. We'll have about 140 interns with us in the Bay Area this summer, up from 5 in that first pilot summer. But we've also taken learnings from that work to start addressing different systemic challenges. So one of the things that we realized through vetting, at this point, thousands of Black and Latinx computer science students. We've placed hundreds of students at dozens of companies. One of the things that we saw was that the skills required to do the job were different than the skills required to get the job. And even the students who were equipped to do the job, they could sort of pass that tech assessment, didn't necessarily look the way companies were expecting and have the skills to make it through the job interview process. So we built programming around that. What we also realized was that when students showed up at companies, a lot of times the companies were not actually ready to have a diverse workforce. They were not actually inclusive. And it wasn't issues of, oh, this company is racist or that company is racist, but there were just structures and policies in place that had sort of worked fine with their existing population, but weren't going to scale as they wanted to become more inclusive. So we were able to start holding up a mirror to companies using the data that we gathered from the Fellows Program. I'll give one quick example. So if you are hiring, you see your false positives, which means if you interview someone and they seem like they're going to be great, you hire them, they show up, it turns out they're a disaster, you see and feel that. And that makes people really risk averse. You almost never see your false negatives, where you pass on a candidate who would have been amazing, they go off into the world, you go off and hire someone else, you almost never see where that person lands or what you missed out on. But with Code 2040, we were able to show companies their false negatives. They would pass on 5 of our students and say these students are not qualified. And then a month later, we would say, here are the companies where those students ended up. And over again, companies would be like, oh, that turns out that was a mistake, huh? And so using that sort of data, we were able to say to companies, okay, let's deconstruct and rebuild your vetting and assessment process so that you're not missing out on talent from other backgrounds. So we have a company culture change and training piece that we do. And then the final bucket, so that you can think of all that as the existing system, kind of existing companies, existing pathways. And then the final part is entrepreneurship. If we're looking at a 20-plus year time horizon, we know that a lot of the companies that we all think and talk about day in and day out today didn't exist 20 years ago. And so similarly, we want to ensure that the companies that are dominating industries in the next 10, 15, 20 years are built by a much broader array of people, and that there are Black and Latino founders who are able to fund and grow their companies. So we do entrepreneurship work as well around the country.
Laura, is there any information that's available about how this kind of impacts GDP, for example? Have you guys studied that about, how not having these people in the workforce actually impacts, the output of the country and things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I haven't seen GDP numbers specifically, but the way that we think about that is 2 different numbers. One is that the median household income of a Black family and a Latino family combined is the same as the starting salary for a worker in a tech company. So if you think about the potential for getting into one of these jobs to change not just your own personal trajectory, but your family, your community, it's huge. And then the other is looking at closing that wealth gap. So the median net worth of a white family is about 15 times that of a Black or Latino family. And particularly when you look at entrepreneurship, where starting a company often involves either bootstrapping at the beginning, kind of covering your own expenses, or friends and family funding. You know, the median net worth of a Black or Latinx household is about $5,000 to $7,000. There's no friends and family funding there. And beyond that, most of the entrepreneurs we work with are funding their friends and family. They are supporting, actually, their friends and family. And so that is another area where you start to think about the ripple effects of actually creating these pathways and building generational wealth. It'll completely transform those overall numbers like GDP.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, education is something that's important to you as well. I would say education is the great equalizer in our society, and I'm the first in my family to go to college, but the high school is very impressive. So tell us about your education compact in Richmond. What are you trying to accomplish, and what made you take that step?
Yeah, you know, when I ran for mayor last year, I sat down with a couple mayors who don't have authority over school boards, over their public school system. But they told me that the mayor could play a serious role in driving the narrative on public education. In some places, you know, the mayor has, you know, in Washington, D.C., for instance, you know, Adrian Fenty kind of took over schools. That was not going to be possible in the city of Richmond. But I always thought that the mayor could be the vehicle for collaboration. So what the Education Compact does is it gets the mayor's office, the school board, and the city council around the table to create a shared agenda around public education. Shared outcomes, shared strategies. For far too long in Richmond, we've had, and here's the thing, Richmond is no different than any other city with different bodies who have education as a priority. But a lot of times, we've had fights over money, conflict over money. And as you all know, conflict sells these days. That's clickbait for a lot of people. And so what I thought, which I don't think is novel, is that why don't we get around the table and actually chart out what we want to see, where we want to see public education 20, 30 years from now, and kind of extinguish the fights. And so what we've begun is we've put together a document that lays out what we want to do around workforce development, pre-K initiatives, after-school programs, because we know that it's not just about investing in the child in the classroom, but the child, also the entire child outside the classroom as well. So using everything we have in the organization at City Hall and wrapping it around the child, I think is key to ensure that each child has an opportunity to succeed in Richmond. So it's something that's been used in Denver. It's something that's been used in Miami as well, allowing for all stakeholders, not just city council, school board, and the mayor, but also all our higher education institutions and also the private sector, so we can actually insulate the child from pre-K through 16.
Okay, thank you. Earlier, Stephen, when you were sucking up to the hometown crowd here, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison are all from this area, basically. They're all from this area, some of the founding fathers. What do you think they would think about today's discourse? You mentioned this a bit. And what role do millennials have to play in changing that discourse? And how can we help support them as they make those changes?
Yeah, I think they would be totally fine with the disagreement we're seeing today. They would have a problem with how we're disagreeing, because we're disagreeing in ways that are portraying the other side as evil. There's a study that shows over the past 2 decades or so, the levels upon which we see the other side as being evil has grown like 3 times. And that's problematic because, as Washington talked about in his farewell address, he said that essentially extreme partisanship, where the parties got to this kind of extreme level of disagreement, that would create a facilitated access for foreign corruption. And for authoritarian-like figures. So I think the founding fathers in some ways predict, and they were not purely innocent themselves in the ways that they were going about forming political parties, but they were able to predict some of the things that we were seeing today. And I think similarly, if you look at what Madison was able to do during the Constitutional Convention, first of all, I love that he was one of the youngest. Was he the youngest? He was the youngest delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and he was the most prepared with the Virginia Plan, and he was had the highest attendance rate, and as a result became the most influential. He was elected to Congress when he was 29 years old, and he was millennial aged, 36 years old when he wrote the Constitution. Now, whenever I say that, people say, well, they just died younger back then. Madison lived to be 85 years old. Not only that, you know, one of the formative experiences I had when I was deciding, you know, this whole topic, I guess, is about civic entrepreneurship. So, like, when do you decide to actually become an entrepreneur? And I had a normal, like, stable job in DC working at the World Bank before this, and I was deciding, like, we had this concept, like, do I take this leap of faith? Am I crazy enough to do this? And I had this moment when I was going by the memorials. I was going on a run, and I got in front of the Jefferson Memorial. And I remember thinking, this is a guy who lived to be 83 years old, but he wrote the Declaration of Independence when he was 33. And if you looked at the majority of the founding fathers in 1776, they were under the age of 40. Dr. King was 34 when he gave I Have a Dream, 26 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. So I'm like standing in front of these memorials and I'm thinking the age upon which you have the kind of the most potential to innovate and create these civic entrepreneurial efforts really is in your 20s and 30s when you're millennial aged. So that's why we ended up founding the Millennial Action Project, because we think this generation of millennials who are today in our 20s and 30s need to be on the forefront of creating political transformation. If prior generations have been able to do it, that's the history of our country. Why not our generation today?
Great. So we've got a little bit of flavor for everyone's perspective and their backgrounds, and the purpose of the panel is to help people understand either specific examples of how we can innovate in the social entrepreneur realm or in the government. And so can government embrace Silicon Valley, and what does that look like exactly? And Laura, you worked in the White House. What is a simple example that you used? And then how do we think about this like 20, 30, 40 years from now? Like, where are we going with this?
Yeah, so I worked with the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, Megan Smith, in the Obama White House for the last 6 months of the administration. And it was a really fascinating experience because the sort of digital 44, those of us kind of in the Obama administration in the digital space, was like this group of folks, a lot of whom were Silicon Valley transplants, but from all over the country who had been working in private sector in tech and digital, and then made the leap to innovate in government. And the United States Digital Service is a great example of this, the CTO's office, my office, but there were people across all of the agencies, CTOs, CIOs, who were doing incredible innovative work within government and within those agencies. And a lot of it was looking at how we kind of stick to the core outcomes that we're looking for, but totally reimagine the process to getting there. And probably the classic example is the redesign of vets.gov, where veterans were way under-enrolling in health insurance, and when the team went out and actually did some of that user experience work and sat down with vets as they were attempting to enroll, they realized that a big chunk of the problem was like it was just too complicated. Like it was too confusing. There were too many different forms on too many different web pages. There were PDFs that needed to be printed. The process didn't work, and that was literally keeping people from getting the care that they needed. And so they took a lot of those digital tools that they'd sort of honed or learned in the private sector and applied those approaches to a core government benefit and totally revamped the vets.gov site and the entire process for veterans getting access to health care. And those sorts of things can be done and have been done across government in a number of different ways at not just the federal, but state and local levels as well. And I think that's, sometimes for folks who don't spend their time immersed in tech or the tech sector, it can seem like tech is the end goal. But technology is just a tool or a process. And so a big way to think about incorporating it, whether you're working within government or looking to be a civic entrepreneur and start an organization, is what's a broken process that technology would be an efficient way to fix? And then looking at what the impact is going to be on the folks who are engaging in it. So I think, you know, from my brief stint in federal government, I just saw huge success in leveraging tech as a tool, even within traditional government structures.
When I first entered my job on Capitol Hill for my friend Seth Moulton, I literally said out loud, coming to Capitol Hill was like getting in a time machine. Because the technology is so antiquated. Did you have a similar culture shock experience, Mr. Mayor? It seems like that comment resonates with you.
Yes, well, I worked in state government for a couple of years before going across the street to city government. And I really stepped back a couple of decades. I felt like, you know, we're still using paper tickets in some places. But then I've also seen the advancement by some of our agencies. For instance, the Richmond Ambulance Authority, you know, their use of data has been very, very helpful. You know, in government, surprising, you all may already know this, that we have finite resources, right? We just can't throw money at every problem that we may have. And so I think the use of data is key. Me and my team visited Cincinnati a couple months back, and their use of data, it was unbelievable. The ability to predict where the next pothole will erupt, the ability to show residents when we're going to pave your street next. The example I wanted to use at the Richmond Ambulance Authority, you know, they over years have collected an enormous amount of data, and they were able to actually plot different ambulances around the city because they know where the call volume will be the highest on a certain time of day, and those trucks move around the city due to the data. Now, we don't use data the way that some of the private sector does, but I think if we want to actually maximize the resources that we currently have, you have to use that data to kind of preempt the problems. In government, we've been so reactive. We wait for a problem to happen. How about we just go ahead and preempt the problem before it actually happens? And I think that's what data helps.
That's a great example. The city of Boston created an application that citizens could put on their phone, and it would actually use the accelerometer in the iPhone to detect when there was a pothole or a problem in the road, and they would coordinate that with geo-coded data. So that's kind of that seems crazy, but that app is actually a couple years old now, and they've been collecting data for a while.
Yeah, I think there should be a very mutually beneficial relationship between the two. One of the advisors on our board is a guy named Anish Chopra, who I think preceded Megan by 2 people, I believe, as the CTO. And he talks about how we not only need an innovative state, but also a state of innovation. So on one side, Silicon Valley has a lot to offer government in the ways that we administer government, in the ways that you were talking about. I think there are a lot of ways in the legislative process. A few years ago, they started the U.S. Digital Service, which is like a SWAT team of talented kind of tech people who go in and solve problems in government. We're trying to create an analog to that in Congress called the Congressional Digital Service right now. So there's a lot we can learn from a best practices standpoint as well as a talent standpoint, facilitating this talent pipeline in. Another key one is the Presidential Innovation Fellows. There are many of these programs that are great, and we need more of them. At the local level and state level, there's a group called Fuse Corps that helps bring in this sort of talent into government. But the reverse is true, too, because government is the largest funder of research and development in the country. So when you talk about, we were talking earlier about the role of tech transfer in a city like Charlottesville or Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm from, the largest source of funding for that is from governmental sources. And so there's a key role to play in accelerating innovation from the government standpoint. And to pick up on a topic you were mentioning earlier is creating an acceptance around failure when the government is trying to innovate. Some of you might remember a few years ago there was this whole controversy around Solyndra, which was a solar company that the federal government was investing in. What that whole debate lost perspective on was that was such a small percentage of the failure rate within the government's energy innovation portfolio, and actually the success rate was absurdly high. Actually, some experts thought the government's success rate was too high, because if it's so high, then the private sector should be throwing in their money as well. So long story short here is the government has a huge role to play in investing in basic research and development, but on the flip side also needs talent and practices from the Silicon Valley to help open up government, make it more responsive to citizens.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, let's check in with the folks here and see if we have any questions at this time for our panelists, see how we're doing on the discussion, and what other things would you like to hear the panelists answer? Do we have any questions at this time? Adam's got a mic over here. And I'm so sorry, I don't know your name. Anna has the mic over there, so thank you, Anna. What questions do we have?
Hi, my name is Danny Martin, and I'm a civic entrepreneur. I have a startup business, and one of the things that's been difficult for me is to identify the exact points of contact in cities and counties to speak with about my innovation. One thing that's actually would be really helpful to me is to is if cities and counties had an established business process and points of contact for innovative technologies. Somebody that I could reach out to, and they could farm me out, connect me with the right people to maybe engage in a research project as an entry level to a larger engagement with a city or county. I'm wondering if you know of best practices in cities and counties that you can share.
Mr. Mayor, any ideas? You're our expert here on local and state and government.
You know, I hear that that problem about government all the time. I want to start my business. I want help with my business, but don't know where to go to or have difficulty getting anything off the ground. And I'll admit, we are in that camp of localities that have a difficult time in, I would say, cultivating and creating that ecosystem. And so a lot of times it's happening organically. And government is normally behind the eight ball. What we're trying to do now, though, is follow, I guess you would say, some of the best practices we saw in a place like Cincinnati, where they've kind of streamlined the permitting process. The business licensing process right there as well. They get people around the table. They call it an innovation lab. And they get folks around the table, folks who have a hand in the process from soup to nuts, and bring a consultant in, and they're locked in this room for hours on end on how to actually break down the process and streamline it. So they're using sticky notes, red, yellow, and green. Red were areas that they actually fail, and green where they're actually doing well. And actually, that's what we plan to do in the city of Richmond. And because I think there's a lot of dollars on the table. And when you're looking for that investment, I told you we have finite resources. If you can streamline the process, you're going to get more investment from the private sector. And so I think it's key that a lot of we try our best to hack the current predicament.
I would just add something that the Small Business Administration did under the Obama administration was something called Startup in a Day in partnership with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And essentially, it is a way for small businesses to go to a single website and see everything that they need to get up and running and to file all those forms in a single day. Last I checked, there are 100+ cities participating, and it was also tied to, I'm already losing all my government acronyms, but there's SBA has local business development centers in different cities where you can literally go in and have office hours with someone who can help you navigate the process and potentially get connected to government resources. The giant caveat to what I'm saying is is it still on the web? I don't know. But ObamaWhiteHouse.gov is the archive of everything from the Obama administration, so try Googling it.
Sorry, Lauren. Two quick thoughts. One is that one of the things that we have seen proliferate a little bit more in the last 5 years is a chief innovation officer for cities. And all that really means is a person who's a little more prone to taking a risk or a little more prone to understanding technology. And so if you could, I mean, even if it was, I don't know if Richmond has one, but, there are other cities that do. Try to talk to those people first. They're going to be less risk averse than, just to be frank, a traditional person in the path. The second thing.
We're in the market for one.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Stoney will hook you up. Okay, so the other thing is that the reason that technology scales is because it has common standards and protocols. And that's what Mr. Mayor's talking about, basically, is if we could have a system where it was very easy to file the same paperwork across the system, that's the kind of thinking that we need at the local level as well as the state and federal level, because that can save entrepreneurs a lot of time if they can access the same municipal unit using an API or something like that. The next question?
Just a quick response from the sort of grandmother view. If you're in a community, there has to be a clerk's office, a board of supervisors office, a county executive's office. Whoever answers the phone in that office will be able to direct you rather than having you spend 3 hours looking at something on the web. That's just the quick and old-fashioned way that might help a lot.
Yeah, that the technologists want a computer to do it, and of course, just talk to a human being. Okay, what about back here, Anna?
Thanks so much for your presentations. Well, you mentioned the language of pathways. One of the things that we're struggling with in our work in cities is that I had a program officer at a foundation say, I don't know where the innovators are because the city that we're working in doesn't have what you call the conditions for social innovation to take shape. And so not all cities are equal in this respect. I'm wondering, can you help us think about what the conditions under which social innovation emerges, what those conditions are? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, so one of the things that Code 2040 is doing is in our entrepreneurship work, we partner with Google for Entrepreneurs, and Google has identified 8 cities around the country where they see sort of emerging entrepreneurial ecosystems that they want to support. And our piece of the puzzle there is helping to ensure that those ecosystems reflect the communities that they are in. So some of this is sort of taken from not just kind of Code 2040's work, but my observation of what these ecosystems have done and are doing. And a big part of the work that I see these different tech hubs undertaking, first and foremost, they actually create a tech hub. So there is like a central clearinghouse for if you are interested in innovation or entrepreneurship, even if it's just an interest. You're not starting a company, you're not an employee of a company, you're not a funder, you're just interested, you know this is the place that you can go. And a big part of what these hubs do is they host meetups. They'll have little kind of educational sessions to help folks get things off the ground. They'll run incubators, which is sort of, when you maybe just have an idea and you're thinking about whether it could turn into a company, kind of a process or a program for folks to go to. Because what I hear you saying is that, like, as long as people are sort of scattered and distributed, it's really hard to support folks or to kind of find folks and knit them together. And building a network and getting access to resources are two things that are hugely important when you actually are kind of spinning up a new initiative or a new company. And once these hubs exist, they serve as a magnet for folks who have an interest but didn't know how to channel it. And the challenge then, which these hubs are really embracing in the cases of the ones that we work with, is how do you then go out and evangelize as well? Go to the local universities, go to communities that maybe wouldn't necessarily go to that part of town on their own, or don't have a friend or a cousin who's already showing up there, and actually make sure that the group of people that know about the opportunities reflects the community as a whole. But some type of hub where folks can kind of come together and mix and mash up ideas and kind of have complementary skill sets, I think is the first step to actually accelerating the development of kind of an entrepreneurial ecosystem or innovative community.
Tony Hsieh, who founded Zappos, has referred to this as collisions. You need a certain amount of collisions to get innovative thinking going, or people from different backgrounds, and that's a very important concept as things get off the ground.
I was going to add real quick, I think what a lot of governments have a hard time or have a problem tackling is bringing innovators inside the doors of City Hall. And a lot of times I think it's because the folks who work in your human resources, your town office, they they don't see the skills of entrepreneurs, social innovators, as skills that are necessary for old school City Hall. And so I think getting the right people in HR who recognize the skills, particularly that millennials may have, that may not be the same skills that you've seen for the last 25 years, is key. I'm also looking for an HR director, if anyone knows. This is a recruitment trip for me.
I was about to say, no, I see why you're on the panel now, Mr. Mayor. Stephen, do you want to say something about that?
No, we can.
Okay, good.
I'm interested in, you've talked about how communities have trouble with funding, which is very clear. I'm the director of planning for the county. And we also have the tendency to look to kind of become, in a sense, experts at spawning innovation without necessarily looking at our current strengths. And if you have limited funding, you might be able to play into that a little bit more cost effectively by taking advantages of the things you do have. Like, so my question for you, and you talked already a little bit about the, let's call it the resource connecting with the right people infrastructure, but there's other kinds of infrastructures. Communities buy things, communities do certain public works kind of things. What would be the best entrepreneur infrastructure with things that governments and communities already have that they could do a better job with?
I can jump in for that. So I'll speak about one piece of the infrastructure, which is creating the funding community for entrepreneurs. In places outside of, say, Silicon Valley or Boston, there often aren't these networks of angel investors and venture capitalists. So what do you do about that? Well, one of the laws that we have been putting on the books in many states across the country, and then was finally authorized nationally by the federal government, was the crowdfunding laws. But and the whole idea of crowdfunding is similar to how you would raise money from peers for Kickstarter. You can now do that for your startup. You can go to, say, your friend who can put in $1,000 or $5,000 instead of going to an institutional VC, which in theory sounds great, and you can democratize investment. But since then, the data we've been seeing is that these crowdfunding opportunities have been highly underutilized. A lot of local governments have not created or state governments have not created the platforms for these entrepreneurs to connect with investors. And for the few platforms that do exist, they've been suffering from very low participation rates. I really don't, in my gut, I don't think that is due to a lack of interest. I think it might more likely be due to a lack of awareness and enough institutionalization among local and state governments. So I think that is an example of a resource that is already on the books that I think local governments can really take and champion, but it needs more kind of firepower, more manpower, maybe we can recruit a few people here, to run these platforms, and as well as just more. In Wisconsin, for example, there's a guy who's been trying to get this platform off the ground, but just has not gotten the web developers and the whole teams in place. So I think the governments can be a convener to get people together around this resource, which is already, it used to be illegal to do this, but now it's authorized, it's on the books, and I think communities would be wise to take advantage of it.
In the new economy, communities have to export to the world the thing they do best. And so that's why it's so important to step back and think about what that region can do best. And it's a collaborative effort for sure. Anna in the back.
I just wanted to thank you for framing the initial conversation around users, because there's a trend that I've noticed that users are actually the ones that are creating value, and the business models that I've seen are based on users creating value. And I was curious to hear if you thought that, or to see if the users were able to monetize that value and get compensated for the value that they create. And I cite a particular IPO that came out where some celebrity said, I brought millions and millions of people to your app, but then that person was cut out of the IPO process. And so I'm curious to see how you're thinking about the value that users create and how users can benefit from that.
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the central questions of the new economy. Like so many of the business models that we're seeing are based on selling data, and that data is user data. And ostensibly, the sort of unvocalized trade that's being made is I get value from your service, and so I will trade you my data in exchange for being able to use it. And that's why so many of these services that we use day in and day out, particularly social services, are completely free to the user. But the question then becomes like who's valuing that data and when, like who's getting the raw end of the deal, if there is one, is it really equitable? And I think particularly as you start to dig in on questions like this, where in your example it was a celebrity, but you know, across the board, the folks who are profiting from the creation of these services and the harvesting of this data are, again, not representative of even their user base, much less the country as a whole. Not to get sort of too abstract, but when we think about like the trajectory of the economy over the next 20 years and the way that not just technologies but tech sector approaches are increasingly permeating all aspects of the economy, I think it's a really troubling question of what does it look like when we are all tracked all the time, and everything that we put out there, like on whatever platform, like someone is monetizing that, because I 100% promise you they are. And who gets to control that data? Whose data is it? Who gets to monetize that data? Who benefits from it? And there's some really troubling trends that I think we're not talking enough about the ways in which the folks who are holding the reins and controlling this economy now, first of all, it's private sector. This is highly underregulated. This is not turned into really a government issue yet. I mean, the terms of service are really largely set by the executive teams at these companies, and they're for the benefit of the bottom line. That's sort of the definition of them running a for-profit company. And so part of, I think, what was interesting about being on the government side and sitting in the White House on the tech team was seeing sort of the pieces of these conversations that were happening about what is the role of regulation when regulation cannot, practically by definition, keep up with the innovation in the space, because the processes for regulation and innovation are just completely mismatched in terms of speed, but we have to figure out how to protect the user and the consumer. So that's like a giant non-answer, except to say that like I'm really glad that you asked that, because it's like one of those things that we really need to start having conversations about more and more often, and it's going to have to be us speaking up about it, because these companies have no incentive to lean into this conversation unless citizens and governments are forcing them to.
Okay, so what did we learn today? We learned that Mayor Stoney's here to recruit you. We are a little divided on who Stephen's favorite president is, because he mentioned 3 from Virginia, and we know Laura's changing the world. I want to tell you a quick story before we go. There was a white superintendent of a majority-minority district in Montgomery County in Maryland, and he found out that his minority students were not taking AP classes. And he said, why are they not taking these classes? And the teachers responded, well, you know, they can't pass the test. And he said, why don't we just do this? How about we ask them to take the class and see where we get? And he found out that his minority students passed that test at about the same rate as their white peers. So this is an important lesson for all of us to have high expectations of each other. Thanks very much.